Welcome back. You're watching The Contrarians, where I'm joined by a raft of people we won't go through. Let me start with you, Hugh, on this issue of Margaret Thatcher. Vale Margaret Thatcher, she's passed away now. I suspect that you would have been a strong ideological supporter of hers back in the day.
No, funnily enough, I wasn't. I can't say that I'm mourning her loss and Thatcherism.
It's a bit of a rough thing to say, though, isn't it? I mean,
no, not at all. You know, just because someone's dead doesn't mean that you should suddenly, oh, they're all great and we like them.
Yeah, but just because you don't like somebody's policies doesn't mean you should be glad that they're dead.
Thatcherism was more than just a few policies. It had a major impact on the world. And it destroyed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people's lives, from the killing fields of Northern Ireland throughout to places like Brixton and the north of England, and then ideologues from all throughout the world who then took on her ideas and her neoliberal ideas that destroyed industries, that destroyed social infrastructure.
Like and Bob Hawke,
well, wait a second. I'm glad you raised that, because they are two people who did not take on her ideology. They were the ones,
They did some privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank.
Know about, right?
They did.
Well,
They did
not. Let's you talk and then I'll come to you, Julie.
Whilst Thatcher really stripped away the social infrastructure and took away the safety nets and let wealthy people just make money and get wealthier, whilst the poor were neglected and destroyed, right, especially in the UK, that didn't happen here. Yes, there was restructuring. The Australian economy had to be restructured, and Hawke and Keating did that. Now, did they do it in the same way as Thatcher and with Thatcherism? No, they didn't. They kept the social safety nets. They transferred us into a global economy whilst keeping a compassionate and caring government that looked after the vulnerable in our society and transitioned ourselves into, by the 90s, into a leader in the economy.
What's an example? Like, give me a couple of policy examples of something that Hawke and Keating did that Thatcher clearly did the opposite.
Oh, well, if you look at the way that, you know, the trade union movement had to go through some major reforms. They really did. Here we had the Accord. Yeah. That was a way of doing that. It kept the social safety nets, it kept the awards and things like that. Still at the same time, it restructured the industries and restructured those unions. In the UK, she just fought them. All right, she fought the unions, she destroyed industries in the process, she took away safety nets and did the complete opposite of what we had here.
Let me get a response from Julian and then I'll come back to you.
That is in part because in England the unions were so militant. I mean, the key figure in Australia that's different is Bob Hawke himself, who was able to bring the union movement to the table. In England, the union movement were all like the MUA has been here in this country, or the CFMEU in its most militant incarnations. In England,
I want to come back to you, Julian, just very quickly. Do you reject that? You think that there was...
Absolutely. You're right, there were some militant unions. The miners were one example from that. But instead of actually... And there were militant unions here. Yeah. I spent, like a lot of us, you know, Ed's the same, spent many years fighting the hard left in the trade unions and bringing moderation to the union movement in Australia and certain unions. Now, over there wasn't even an attempt to do that. There were plenty of moderate unions in the UK which she could have worked with, but she didn't. She refused to. Now, it wasn't just about unions, though.
So she chose to highlight the more militant ones. Is that your point?
Yeah, of course. And if you put someone who's militant in a corner, they're going to fight back. Of course they would. Now, did I agree with what Scargill did and some of the mining stuff? Not necessarily, right? But you were talking about not just Scargill and not just the miners' union. You were talking about entire industries, right, which were being destroyed.
To remember, though, I mean, I've been a member of the journalists' union my whole career, but I do feel that as the daughter of a granddaughter of a very working class Yorkshire family, there were a lot of working people who were suffering at the hands of the unions before Margaret Thatcher's reforms came along. The wharfies, in some cases the mining unions.
When you would say suffering at the hands of the union,
they were ripping off poor people. They were ripping off.
How were they ripping them off?
The wharfies were stealing from the docks in an absolutely rampant fashion.
The same way the HSU were doing it today, I think is Claire's point.
Yes, it was. I think there were absolutely the same thing was going on with the printing unions. There were entire ghost shifts working on every shift at printing presses. You know, I don't think. I think it's wrong to suggest that working people all suffered only because of Thatcher.
Ed Husic, I've always thought of you as a bit of a sort of closet Thatcher fan. Am I right?
What you don't know about me, it'd probably fill a warehouse, so good call. In actual fact, I mean, I have to say, just going back, I thought Hugh's point was absolutely spot on, that in terms of the difference between Thatcher and Hawke Keating was the Accord, and that whole notion of consensus. that really
You're
did...
nodding, Julian, whereas before you tried to say that they were the same.
I said it was because of Bob Hawke himself. You
did
had a
make that
person
point.
like Hawke
Absolutely, you did
who was
make that
able to make that
And that was a
difference.
fe-
And Thatcher didn't have
And
something
that was a
like
feature of our 83 campaign about reconciliation and recovery, was about bringing people together, and there was clearly in terms of Margaret Thatcher, she sought another line, which was confrontation and winning through that process.
You know what's fascinating is if John Howard had won that 87 election, he probably would have been a Thatcherite-style Prime Minister, whereas he was a very
Really good
different Prime Minister by the time he got in 96.
Well, he saw what had happened throughout the 80s and what Thatcher had done, and that confrontation and the destruction of the social infrastructure in the UK. He knew if he tried doing that here, and he tried it once really, because he was still a Thatcherite ideologue all the way through his time, but he realised, right, that he couldn't try and bring it in Australia. They tried it once in the end when they tried to bring in work choices.
But the
That
other
was the
point I
only
just
thing they
wanted to
could,
make-
and
do you
look what
mind if I
happened to
just-
him.
The other point I just wanted to make too is, for people to... I think this is where we have a big difference in terms of, and I mean, you made a comment earlier about Hawke Keating picking up Thatcher. I mean, there was this, sweeping change in terms of economic approach that was happening across the world that, Thatcher picked up. I think people would accept that both Thatcher and Reagan picked up the debate that was happening within economics. And so there was this change of approach about what governments would do post-Keynes, recognising this devil of stagflation and that economies just weren't working the way that they once were and they needed to change. So there was a move to try and reduce the role of government, and everyone was having to deal with that.
Just very quickly, completely separate issue. In WA, James Price Point, a lot of annoyance, certainly at the state level in WA by Colin Barnett, that Woodside won't be going ahead, but there is still some chance for an offshore processing, which of course the difference there is the royalties, if it's offshore, go to the feds, whereas the royalties at a state level would go at the state level if it's onshore. Is that all this is about, or is the prospect of doing anything in serious peril?
Colin Barnett spent a lot of political capital and time on this particular issue. There have been native title issues, there have been environmental approvals and so on. I think there would be a reasonable degree of anger in Western Australia about this being paused, basically because there's been so much political capital, time and effort to get this project to a point where it could start. So I think, part of Barnett's problem here will be that he has put so much on the table and he'll want to get a result.
Let's hope it does go ahead in some form. If they can't do it, in the Kimberley on the land itself, just hope that they go to a platform or something like that. And I think Woodside, even though they've said they're going to pull out and people are criticising them for that, I mean, it has to be based on what profits they can make and on economic value. So let's hope they do find a way so they can bring jobs to the Kimberley, that they can find a way of either piping it down further south or something like that and having platforms. But it shouldn't be just based on royalties and shouldn't be worried about where the taxes are going. It should be looking at what's the best for us setting up industry and infrastructure up in the Kimberley.
All right, that's all we've got time for on this particular segment. We're going to take a commercial break. Ed Husic's got to go. Crimea River, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you on board. Don't start walking out just yet.
No, I had you say
tweet.
you read out tweets. Michael O'Hare from Richard Johnson Anglican School says, tell Peter Van Onsen about Fiddler on the Roof. Great production by that school this week that I got to see.
That's
a tweet
shameless,
worth reading.
absolutely shameless. We're going to take a commercial break. We'll be back in a moment.